I never thought a tiny rubber stamp would become the thing that haunted me more than the money, the lies, or even the people I betrayed. For obvious reasons, I'm calling myself William. I've seen people online confess to affairs, addictions, and family secrets, so I guess this is my version. I'm not looking for sympathy, and I'm definitely not trying to convince anyone that what I did was justified. It wasn't. I crossed a line because I convinced myself I was smarter than everyone else and that rules only existed for people who lacked imagination. Back then, I wasn't some criminal mastermind. I was just drowning in debt, juggling temporary jobs, and watching every bill arrive faster than my paychecks. Every rejection letter made me a little more desperate. Every overdue notice chipped away at the part of me that still believed I was an honest person. Then one afternoon I noticed something almost laughably insignificant on an official document that landed on my desk at work. A seal. Nothing flashy. Just an embossed mark and a bit of ink that silently told everyone, this document is authentic. Most people never look twice at something like that. I did. And that tiny observation started me down a path that changed my life in ways I never expected. If I'd simply looked away that day, I probably wouldn't be writing this confession years later. Instead, I became obsessed with a dangerous question. What if the smallest detail was the only thing standing between an ordinary piece of paper and absolute trust? The strange thing is that my decision didn't happen all at once. People like to imagine there's a dramatic moment when someone chooses to become a criminal, but for me it was more like drifting with the current until I couldn't remember where the shore was. I kept telling myself I was only exploring an idea. Curiosity felt harmless, almost intellectual. I wanted to understand why people trusted official paperwork so completely. At work I noticed how quickly documents moved from one desk to another without anyone questioning the marks that made them look legitimate. That realization stayed with me long after I clocked out. Every evening I sat in my apartment, surrounded by overdue bills and final notices, convincing myself that I was thinking through a hypothetical situation, nothing more. The lie I told myself was comforting: as long as I hadn't acted, I was still a decent person. Looking back, I think that's where the real crime began, not with what I eventually did, but with the excuses I rehearsed until they sounded like common sense. Once I'd crossed that mental line, everything around me started looking different. It wasn't that I suddenly saw opportunities everywhere, it was that I stopped seeing boundaries. I spent days thinking about paperwork, approval processes, and how much confidence people placed in appearances. The more I observed, the more I realized that most systems relied on routine. People were busy, distracted, and eager to finish their work. That thought fed my growing arrogance. I convinced myself I had discovered some hidden truth everyone else had missed, when in reality I was just building an excuse to ignore my conscience. I remember lying awake at night, my mind racing between excitement and dread. One minute I'd promise myself I'd forget the whole idea by morning. The next, I'd imagine how much easier my life would be if my financial problems simply disappeared. Every rational thought was met with another justification. Desperation has a way of making terrible ideas sound practical, and I let that desperation become the loudest voice in my head. Eventually, I stopped pretending I was just daydreaming. I made a decision, and somehow that felt both terrifying and oddly calming. Once my mind settled on the idea, I became obsessed with making sure nothing about my behavior stood out. I stuck to my normal routine, joked with coworkers, paid what little I could toward my bills, and acted like everything was fine. Inside, though, I was constantly arguing with myself. One side kept insisting I could still walk away before anything irreversible happened. The other whispered that I'd already come too far to back out. Looking back, I realized that wasn't true at all. I had countless chances to stop. I simply didn't want to admit I was choosing the harder path for all the wrong reasons. The strangest part was how ordinary life looked while I was carrying this secret. People smiled, made small talk, and trusted me without hesitation. Every bit of that trust made the knot in my stomach tighter, because I knew I was preparing to betray it, even if no one else suspected a thing. The day everything finally happened didn't feel dramatic. There was no thunderstorm, no sense that history was being written. It was just another weekday, the kind people forget as soon as it ends. That normality made it easier to keep a straight face, even though my pulse was so loud I was sure someone would notice. I remember checking the time over and over, trying to convince myself I still had the option to leave and never look back. Instead, I kept moving forward. What shocked me most was how ordinary everyone else seemed. They chatted about weekend plans, complained about coffee, and hurried through their routines. Nobody knew I was carrying a secret that felt enormous. Every friendly smile made me hesitate for a split second, but hesitation wasn't enough to stop me. Then came the moment when the counterfeit seal appeared on the document. It was such a tiny mark, barely worth a second glance. Yet the instant it was accepted without question, I realized that one insignificant detail had changed everything. There was no taking it back now, only waiting to see what that single decision would cost me. The moment passed so quietly that, for a second, I wondered if I'd imagined the entire thing. The document was handled like dozens of others. It changed hands, received a quick glance, and disappeared into a stack without anyone raising an eyebrow. That should have made me feel relieved, but instead it left me strangely unsettled. I'd expected resistance, questions, maybe even suspicion. Instead, I was met with complete indifference. Walking away was harder than I'd expected. My legs felt unsteady, and every conversation around me sounded muffled, as if I were underwater. I became convinced that someone would call my name at any moment. Every ringing phone made my stomach tighten. Every laugh in the hallway sounded like it was about me. Of course, none of it was. People continued with their day, unaware that I was unraveling inside. Outwardly, I'd managed to look calm. Inwardly, I was replaying every second, searching for some tiny mistake I'd overlooked. Fear replaced excitement almost instantly, and I realized that getting away with something doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like the beginning of a much longer nightmare. For the rest of that week, I lived in a strange state between confidence and panic. Every morning I expected to walk into work and find someone waiting for me with questions I couldn't answer. Instead, everything seemed perfectly normal. Emails kept arriving, meetings came and went, and people joked about deadlines as if nothing unusual had happened. The silence was almost worse than being confronted. It gave my imagination endless room to invent disasters. Then I overheard two co-workers discussing paperwork that had been approved unusually quickly. They didn't sound suspicious, just surprised. One of them laughed and said it must have been someone's lucky day. I forced myself to smile and keep walking, but inside I felt a wave of cold dread. I couldn't tell whether they were talking about the same document or something completely unrelated. That uncertainty became its own punishment. I started reading hidden meanings into ordinary conversations and harmless glances. The smallest coincidence felt like evidence that the truth was closing in. Looking back, I realize fear has a remarkable ability to turn everyday life into a prison of your own imagination. A few days later, the first real crack appeared. A supervisor mentioned that some records were being reviewed because of an unrelated audit. The word audit hit me like a punch. I nodded along with everyone else, pretending it was routine, but my hands were shaking under the desk. Suddenly every harmless detail from the past week felt dangerous. I spent the afternoon trying to act normal while my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Had anyone looked closely at the seal? Had the document been compared with older records? Was there some tiny inconsistency I hadn't considered? I couldn't ask questions without drawing attention to myself, so I sat there silently, trapped inside my own panic. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the moment the document was accepted, wondering if I should have stopped before it reached anyone else. But regret is useless once the consequences are already moving toward you. The next morning, a coworker casually mentioned that investigators might need to ask staff a few questions. He said it with a shrug, but I felt my chest tighten. For the first time, I understood that this was no longer just a secret I carried alone. The interviews started 2 days later, one employee at a time. Nobody was marched into an office or accused of anything. It was all calm, professional, almost polite. That somehow made it more intimidating. People came back saying the questions were simple, mostly about routine procedures and whether they'd noticed anything unusual. They laughed it off, but I couldn't. When my turn came, I felt as if every step down the hallway echoed. The investigator wasn't aggressive. He smiled, offered me a seat, and asked me to describe an ordinary workday. That was the worst part. There was no dramatic interrogation, just ordinary questions that forced me to sound ordinary. I answered as steadily as I could, but my mind kept racing ahead, wondering if he'd suddenly place the document on the table and ask me to explain it. He never did. I walked out feeling relieved for exactly 5 minutes. Then I noticed 2 investigators quietly comparing files outside the conference room. One of them frowned at a page before saying, "Something about this doesn't add up." I couldn't hear anything else, but I was suddenly certain they were one step closer to me. From that point on, I became my own worst enemy. Nobody had accused me, yet I started acting like someone with something to hide. Every email notification made my heart race. Every time my manager asked if I had a minute, I assumed the conversation would end with security escorting me out of the building. The irony is that people probably noticed my anxiety long before they noticed anything else. A coworker asked if I was feeling sick because I looked exhausted. Another joked that I needed a vacation. I laughed along, but it sounded hollow even to me. I wasn't sleeping. Every night I replayed the same memories, searching for a version of events where I'd made a different choice. Eventually, I was asked to clarify a few routine details connected to the paperwork. The questions themselves weren't difficult, but I found myself over-explaining, adding unnecessary information, trying too hard to sound believable. As soon as the conversation ended, I knew I'd made a mistake. Honest people usually answer a question and move on. Guilty people keep talking, hoping more words will somehow bury the truth. I had become one of them, and I hated recognizing that in myself. A week later, the uncertainty finally ended. I was called into a meeting with senior staff and investigators, and the atmosphere told me everything before anyone spoke. The document had been examined more closely after inconsistencies surfaced during the review. It wasn't one dramatic discovery that exposed everything. It was a collection of tiny details that, together, painted a picture no one could ignore. The counterfeit seal was only one piece of it, but it was the piece that caused people to question the rest. I remember trying to stay composed while they explained what they had found. They weren't shouting or trying to intimidate me. In some ways, their calm professionalism made the situation feel even heavier. When they asked if there was anything I wanted to add, I realized I had reached the end of every excuse I'd rehearsed in my head. I could have kept denying it, but I was exhausted, more emotionally than physically. The fear of being discovered had consumed me for days, and carrying that weight had become unbearable. For the first time since this began, I stopped trying to control the story and accepted that the consequences were finally catching up with me. Admitting what I'd done didn't bring the relief I expected. People always say that telling the truth lifts a weight off your shoulders, but that's only part of the story. The fear of being exposed disappeared, yet it was immediately replaced by something much harder to live with, the realization that I destroyed the trust people had placed in me. What stayed with me wasn't the investigation or the meetings. It was the expressions on people's faces. Some looked disappointed, others simply confused. A few couldn't even meet my eyes. Those reactions hurt more than any formal consequence ever could because they reminded me that my actions hadn't affected paperwork alone. They had affected real people who had treated me with respect. For weeks afterward, I kept replaying ordinary conversations I'd had before everything fell apart. I wondered how many of those people had believed I was dependable, honest, maybe even a friend. Knowing that I had traded all of that for a decision driven by desperation and arrogance was difficult to accept. That was the moment I understood that rebuilding your own self-respect is often harder than facing anyone else's judgment. The months that followed forced me to sit with myself in a way I never had before. Once the immediate consequences were behind me, there were no more excuses to hide behind. I couldn't blame bad luck, financial pressure, or a broken system. Those things had influenced my choices, but they hadn't made them for me. That distinction was painful, because it meant the responsibility rested exactly where it belonged, with me. I spent a lot of time thinking about the person I believed I was before all this happened. I'd always considered myself decent, someone who occasionally bent the rules but would never deliberately betray people's trust. Looking back, I realized that image survived only because I'd never been tested in quite the same way. When life became difficult, I chose the shortcut instead of the harder, honest path. The guilt never arrived as one overwhelming wave. It settled in quietly, appearing in ordinary moments: a familiar street, an office building, even the sight of official paperwork. Small reminders carried enormous weight because they reminded me how one seemingly insignificant decision had reshaped the course of my life. In the end, the legal consequences eventually became part of my past, but the personal ones never completely disappeared. Finding work again wasn't easy. Every interview felt like another reminder that trust, once broken, isn't something you rebuild overnight. Some people gave me a chance, others didn't, and I couldn't blame them. If our positions had been reversed, I'm not sure I would have acted differently. What surprised me most was how my definition of success changed. Before all this, I measured everything in money and the feeling of staying one step ahead of my problems. Afterward, I started valuing something much simpler: being able to look people in the eye without wondering whether they would discover a secret I was hiding. I still think about that counterfeit seal sometimes. It was such a small object, almost insignificant on its own. Yet it represented the moment I convinced myself that appearances mattered more than integrity. The irony is impossible to ignore. I risked my future over a tiny mark on a document, only to learn that the real damage wasn't on paper, it was to the person I became. If you've read this far, you're probably expecting me to end with some dramatic speech about redemption or karma. The truth is less satisfying. Life doesn't always wrap itself up neatly. You live with your decisions, and sometimes the longest sentence isn't handed down by a court, it's the one you carry in your own mind. When I look back now, I don't see a clever plan or an unlucky mistake. I see dozens of ordinary moments where I could have chosen differently. The counterfeit seal wasn't really the beginning of my downfall. It was only the visible symbol of a much bigger problem. I'd spent weeks convincing myself that my circumstances excused my choices. They didn't. So here's my advice, especially if you're feeling trapped or desperate. Be careful when you start telling yourself that it's only a small thing. That's exactly how people drift into decisions they never imagined making. Small compromises have a way of growing into life-changing consequences. I can't undo what I did. All I can do is tell the story honestly and hope someone else recognizes those warning signs before they make the same mistake I did.